Harry Potter, Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 14, Percy and Padfoot. Harry was first to wake up in his dormitory the next morning. He lay for a moment watching dust swirl in a ray of sunlight coming through a gap in his four-poster hangings, and savored the thought that it was Saturday. The first week of term seemed to have dragged on forever, like one gigantic history of magic lesson. Judging by the sleepy silence and the freshly minted look of that beam of sunlight, it was just after daybreak. He pulled open the curtains around his bed, got up, and started to dress. The only sound apart from the distant twittering of birds was the slow, deep breathing of his fellow Gryffindors. He opened his school bag carefully, pulled out parchment and quill, and headed out of the dormitory for the common room. Making straight for his favorite squashy old armchair beside the new extinct fire, Harry settled himself down comfortably and unrolled his parchment while looking around the room. The detritus of crumpled up bits of parchment, old gobstones, empty ingredient jars, and sweet wrappers that usually covered the common room at the end of each day were gone, as were all of Hermione's elf hats. Wondering vaguely how many elves had now been set free, whether they wanted to or not, Harry uncorked his ink bottle, dipped his quill into it, then held it suspended an inch above the smooth yellowish surface of his parchment, thinking hard. But after a minute or so, he found himself staring into the empty grate, at a complete loss for what to say. He could now appreciate how hard it had been for Ron and Hermione to write him letters over the summer. How he was supposed to tell Sirius everything that had happened over the past week and pose all the questions he was burning to ask without giving potential letter thieves a lot of information he did not want them to have. He sat quite motionless for a while, gazing into the fireplace, then finally coming to a decision, he dipped his quill into the ink bottle and once more set it resolutely onto the parchment. Dear Snuffles, hope you're okay. The first week back here has been terrible. I'm really glad it's the weekend. We've got a new defense against the dark arts teacher, Professor Umbridge. She's nearly as nice as your mom. I'm writing because that thing I wrote to you about last summer happened again last night when I was doing a detention with Umbridge. We're all missing our biggest friend and hope we'll see him back soon. Please write back quickly. Best, Harry. Harry reread the letter several times, trying to see it from the point of view of an outsider. He could not see how they could know what he was talking about or who he was talking about just from reading this letter. He did hope Sirius would pick up on the hint about Hagrid and tell them when he might be back. Harry did not want to ask directly in case it drew too much attention to what Hagrid might be up to while he's not at Hogwarts. Considering it was a very short letter, it had taken a long time to write. Sunlight had crept halfway across the room while he had been working on it, and he could now hear distant sounds and movement from the dormitories above. Sealing the parchment carefully, he climbed through the portrait hole and headed off for the owlery. I would not go that way if I were you, said Nearly Headless Nick, drifting disconcertingly through the wall just ahead of Harry as he walked down the passage. Peeves is planning an amusing joke on the next person to pass the bust of the parceless hallway down the corridor. Does it involve Paracelsus falling on top of the person's head? Asked Harry. Funny enough, it does. Subtly had never been Peeves' strong point. I'm off to try and find the Bloody Baron. He might be able to put a stop to it. See you, Harry. Yep, bye, said Harry, and instead, turning right, he turned left, taking a longer but safer route up to the owlery. His spirits rose as he walked past the window after window, showing brilliantly blue sky. He'll be training later. He would be going back on the Quidditch pitch at last. Something brushed his ankles. He looked down and saw the caretaker's skeletal gray cat, Mrs. Norris, slinking past him. She turned lamp-like yellow eyes on him for a moment before disappearing behind the statue of Wilfred the Wistful. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Harry called after her. She had the unmistakable air of a cat that was off to report to her boss, yet Harry could not see why. He was perfectly entitled to walk up to the owlery on a Saturday morning. The sun was high in the sky now, and when Harry entered the owlery, the glassless windows dazzling his eyes, thick silvery beams of sunlight crisscrossed the circular room in which hundreds of owls nestled on rafters. A little restless in the early morning light, some clearly just returning from hunting. The straw covered floors crunched a little as he stepped across the tiny animal bones, craning his neck for the sight of Hedwig. "There you are," he said, spotting her somewhere near the very top of the vaulted ceiling. "Get down here, I've got a letter for you." With a low hoot, she stretched her great white wings and soared down onto his shoulder. "Right. I know this says Snuffles on the outside," he told her, giving her the letter to clasp in her beak, and without knowing exactly why, whispering, "But it's for Sirius, okay?" She blinked her amber eyes once, and he took that to mean that she understood. "Safe flight," he said then, and he carried her to one of the windows. With a moment's pressure on his arm, Hedwig took off into the blindingly bright sky. He watched her until she became a tiny black speck and vanished, then switched his gaze to Hagrid's hut, clearly visible from the window, and now just as clearly and the uninhibited, the chimney smokeless and curtains drawn. Wow, I'm struggling here. The treetops of the Forbidden Forest swayed in the light breeze. Harry watched them, surveying the fresh air on his face, thinking about Quidditch later. Then he saw it, a great reptilian winged horse, just like the ones pulling the Hogwarts carriages, with leathery black wings spread wide like a pterodactyl, rose up out of the trees like a grotesque giant bird. It soared in a great circle, then plunged back into the trees. The whole thing had happened so quickly, Harry could hardly believe what he had just seen, except that his heart was hammering madly. The owlery door opened behind him. He leapt in shock and turned quickly, saw Cho Chang holding a letter and a parcel in her hands. "Hi," Harry said automatically. "Oh, hi," she said breathlessly. "I didn't think anyone would be up here this early. I only remembered 5 minutes ago. It's my mum's birthday." She held up a parcel. "Right," said Harry. His brain seemed to have jammed. He wanted to say something funny, interesting, but the memory of that terrible winged horse was fresh in his mind. "Nice day," he said, gesturing to the windows. His insides seemed to shrivel with embarrassment. The weather? He was talking about the weather? "Yeah," said Cho, looking around for a suitable owl. "Good Quidditch conditions. I haven't been out all week, have you?" "Nope," said Harry. Cho had selected one of the school barn owls and coaxed it down to her arm, where he held it out in an obliging leg so that she could attach the parcel. "Hey, has Gryffindor got a new keeper yet?" she asked. "Yeah," said Harry. "It's my friend Ron Weasley. Do you know?" "The Tornadoes hater?" said Cho coldly. "Is he any good?" "Yeah," said Harry. "I think so. I didn't see his tryouts, though. I was in detention." Cho looked up, the parcel only half attached to the owl's legs. "That Umbridge woman is foul," she said in a low voice. "Putting you in detention just because you told the truth about how, how, how he died. Everyone heard it. It was all over the school. You were really brave standing up to her like that." Harry's insides reinflated so rapidly he felt as though he might actually float a few inches off the dropping strewn floor. Who cared about the stupid flying horse? Cho thought he had been brave. For a moment, he considered accidentally on purpose showing her his cut. on his hand as he helped her tie her parcel onto her owl. But that very instant was the very instant this thrilling thought occurred, the owlery door opened again. Filch, the caretaker, came wheezing into the room. There was purple patches in his sunken, veined cheeks. His jowls were a quiver, and his thin gray hair disheveled. He was obviously run here. Mrs. Norris came trotting at his heels, gazing up at the owls overhead and meowing hungrily. There was a restless shifting of wings from above, and a large brown owl snapped his beak in a menacing fashion. Aha! Said Filch, taking a flat footed step towards Harry, his pouchy cheeks trembling with anger. I had a tip off that you are intending to place a massive order of dung bombs. Harry folded his arms and stared at the caretaker. Who told you I was ordering dung bombs? Chow was now looking at Harry to Filch, also frowning. The barn owl on her arm, tired of standing on one leg, gave an admonitory hoot, but she ignored it. I have my sources, said Mr. Filch in a self satisfied hiss. Now hand over whatever it is you're sending. Harry, immensely thankful that he had not dawdled in posting off the letter, Harry said, I can't, it's gone. Gone, said Filch, his face contorting with rage. Gone, said Harry calmly. Filch opened his mouth furiously, mouthed a few seconds, and then raked Harry's robes with his eyes. How do I know you haven't got it in your pocket? Because I saw him send it, Cho said angrily. Filch rounded on her. You saw him? That's right, I saw him, she said fiercely. There was a moment pause in which Filch glared at Cho, and Cho glared right back. Then the caretaker turned, shuffled back towards the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle and looked back at Harry. If I get so much as a whiff of a dung bomb. He stomped down the stairs. Mrs. Norris cast a last longing look at the owls and followed him. Harry and now Cho, looked at each other. Thanks, Harry said. No problem, said Cho, finally fixing the parcel to the barn owl's other leg, her face slightly pink. You weren't ordering dung bombs, were you? No, said Harry. I wonder why he thought you were, then, she said, as she carried the owl to the window. Harry shrugged. He was quite as mystified by that as she was, though oddly it was not bothering him very much at the moment. Then they left the owlery together. At the entrance of the corridor that led towards the west wing of the castle, Chow said, I'm going this way. Well, I'll see you around, Harry. Yeah, see ya. She smiled at him and departed. Harry walked on, feeling quietly elated. He had managed to have an entire conversation with her and not embarrass himself once. You were really brave standing up to her like that. Chow had called him brave. She did not hate him for being alive. Of course she had preferred Cedric. He knew that, though if he'd only asked her to the ball before Cedric had, things might have turned out differently. She had seemed sincerely sorry that she had to refuse when Harry asked her. Morning, Harry said brightly to Ron and Hermione as he joined them at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall. What are you looking so pleased about? Said Ron, eyeing Harry in surprise. Quidditch later, Harry said happily, pulling a large platter of bacon and eggs towards him. Oh, yeah, said Ron. He put down a piece of toast he was eating and took a large swig of pumpkin juice. Then he said, Listen, you don't fancy going out a bit earlier with me, do you? Just to give me some practice before training. So I can, get my eye in a bit. Yeah, okay, said Harry. Look, I don't think you should, said Hermione seriously. You both really behind on your homework, but she broke off. The Morning Post was arriving, and as usual, the Daily Prophet was soaring towards her in the beak of a screech owl, which landed precariously close to the sugar bowl and held out one leg. Hermione pushed a knut into the leather pouch, took the newspaper, and scanned the front page critically as the owl took off. Anything interesting? Said Ron. Harry grinned, knowing Ron was keen to keep her off the subject of homework. Of course he was. No, she sighed. Just some gruff about bass player and the weird sisters getting married. Hermione opened the paper and disappeared behind it. Harry devoted himself to another helping of eggs and bacon. Ron was staring up at the high windows, looking slightly preoccupied. Wait a minute, said Hermione suddenly. Oh, no! Serious! What happened? Said Harry, snatching the paper so violently it ripped down the middle, with him and Hermione holding one half. The Ministry of Magic has received a tip-off from a reliable source that Sirius Black, notorious mass murderer, blah blah blah, is currently hiding in London. Hermione read from her half of in an anguished whisper. Lucius Malfoy, I bet anything, said Harry in a low, furious voice. He did recognize Sirius at the platform. What? Said Ron, looking alarmed. You didn't say. Shh, said the other two. Ministry warns wizarding community that Black is very dangerous. Killed 13 people. Broke out of Azkaban. The usual rubbish. Hermione concluded, laying down her half of the paper and looking fearfully at Harry and Ron. Well, he just won't be able to leave the house again, that's all, she whispered. Dumbledore did warn him not to. Harry looked down glumly at a bit of the profit he had torn off. Most of the page was devoted to an advertisement for Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, which was apparently having a sale. Hey, he said, flattening it down so Hermione and Ron could see it. Look at this. I've got all the robes I want, said Ron. No, said Harry. Look, this little piece here. Ron and Hermione bent closer to read it. The item was barely an inch long and placed right at the bottom of the column. It was headlined, Trespass at the Ministry. Sturgis Podmore, 38, of number 2, Labrium Gardens, Clapham, had appeared in front of the Wizengamot, charged with trespass and attempt robbery at the Ministry of Magic on the 31st of August. Podmore was arrested by Ministry of Magic watch wizard Eric Munch, who found him attempting to force his way through the top security door at 1 o'clock in the morning. Podmore, who refused to speak in his own defense, was convicted on both charges and sentenced to 6 months in Azkaban. Sturgis Podmore, Ron said slowly. Is that bloke who looks like his head's been thatched, isn't it? He's the one of the Ron, shh, said Hermione, casting a terrified look around them. 6 months in Azkaban? Whispered Harry, shocked. Just for trying to get through a door? Don't be silly. It wasn't just for trying to get through a door. What on earth was he doing at the Ministry of Magic at 1 o'clock in the morning? Breathed Hermione. Do you reckon he was doing something for the Order? Ron muttered. Wait a minute, said Harry, slowly. Sturgis was supposed to come and see us off, remember? The other two looked at him. Yeah, he was supposed to be part of our guard going to King's Cross. And Moody was all annoyed because he didn't turn up. So he couldn't have been on the job for them, could he? Well, maybe they didn't expect him to get caught, said Hermione. It could be a frame-up, Ron exclaimed excitingly. No, listen, he went on, dropping his voice dramatically as the threatening look on Hermione's face. The Ministry suspects he's one of Dumbledore's lot, so, I don't know. They lured him into the Ministry and he wasn't trying to get through the door at all. Maybe they just made something up to get him. There was a pause while Harry and Hermione considered this. Harry thought it was a far-fetched idea. Hermione, on the other hand, looked rather impressed. Do you know, I wouldn't be all surprised if that were true. She folded up her half of the paper thoughtfully as Harry laid laid down his knife and fork and seemed to come out of reverie. Right. Well, I think we should tackle that essay for Sprout on self fertilizing shrubs first, and if we're lucky, we'll be able to start McGonagall's Animus Conjure spell before lunch. Harry felt a small twinge of guilt at the thought of the pile of homework awaiting him upstairs. But the sky was clear, exhilarating blue, and he had not been on his firebolt all week. I mean, we can do it tonight, said Ron, as he and Harry walked down the sloping lawns towards the Quidditch pitch, their broomsticks over their shoulders. And with Hermione's dire warnings that they would fail all their OWLs still ringing in their ears. And we've got tomorrow. She's got too worked up about work. That's her trouble. There was a pause, and he added in a slightly more anxious tone, do you think she meant it when she said we weren't copying from her? Yeah, I do, said Harry. Still, this is an important too, and we've got to practice if we want to stay on the Quidditch team. Yeah, that's right, said Ron in a heartened tone, and we've got plenty of time to do it all. As they approached the Quidditch pitch, Harry glanced over to his right to where the trees of the Forbidden Forest were swaying darkly. Nothing flew at them. The sky was empty, but for a few distant owls flitting around the Owlery Tower. He had enough to worry about. The flying horse wasn't doing him any harm. He pushed it out of his mind. They collected balls from the cupboard in the changing rooms and set to work. Ron guarding the three tall goalposts. Harry, playing chaser, was trying to get the quaffle past Ron. Harry thought Ron was pretty good. He blocked 3/4 of the goals. Harry attempted to put past him and played better than the longer they practiced. After a couple of hours, they returned to the castle for lunch, during which Hermione made it quite clear she thought they were irresponsible, then returned to the Quidditch pitch for the real training session. All their teammates but Angelica were already in the changing rooms when they entered. All right, Ron, said George, winking at him. Yeah, said Ron, who had become quieter and quieter all the way down the pitch. Ready to show us all up, Inky Prefect? Said Fred, emerging tousled hair from the neck of his Quidditch robes, a slightly malicious grin on his face. Shut up, said Ron, stony-faced, pulling on his own team robes for the first time. They fitted him well, considering they had been for Oliver Wood, who was rather broader in the shoulders. Okay, everyone, said Angelica, entering from the captain's office, already changed. Let's get to it. Alicia and Fred, if you can just bring out the ball crate for us. Oh, and there are a couple of people out there watching, but I want you to just ignore them, all right? Something in her would-be casual voice made Harry think he might know who the uninvited spectators were, and sure enough, when he left the changing rooms for the bright sunlit of the pitch, it was to a storm of catcalls and jeers from the Slytherin Quidditch team and assorted hanger-ons who were grouped halfway up the empty stands and whose voices echoed loudly around the stadium. What's that weasel's writing? Malfoy called in a sneering drawl. Why would anyone put a flying charm on a moldy old log like that? Crabbe and Goyle and Pansy Parkinson guffawed and shrieked with laughter. Ron mounted his broom, kicked off from the ground, and Harry followed him, watching his ears turn red from behind. Ignore them, he said, accelerating to catch up with Ron. We'll see who's laughing after we play them. Exactly the attitude I want, said Angelica approvingly, soaring around them with the quaffle under her arm and slowing to hover in a spot in front of her airborne team. Okay, everyone, We're going to start with some passes just to warm up. The whole team, please. Hey, Johnson, what's with that hairstyle? Anyway, shrieked Pansy Parkinson from below. Why would anyone look like they've got worms coming out of their head? Angelica swept her long braided hair out of her face and continued calmly. Spread out then, and let's see what we can do. Harry reversed away from the others to the far side of the pitch. Ron fell back towards the opposite goal. Angelica and Angelina raised the quaffle with one hand and threw it hard to Fred, who passed it to George, who passed it to Harry, who passed it to Ron, who dropped it. The Slytherins, led by Malfoy, roared and screamed with laughter. Ron, who had pelted towards the ground to catch the quaffle before it landed, pulled out of the dive untidily, so that he slipped sideways on his broom and returned to playing height, blushing. Harry and Fred and George exchanged looks, but uncharacteristically, neither of them said anything, for which he was grateful. Pass it on, Ron, said Angelina, as though nothing had happened. Ron threw the quaffle to Alicia, who passed it to Harry, who passed it to George. Hey, Potter, how's your scar feeling? Called Malfoy. Sure you don't need to lie down? It must be, what, a whole week since you were in the hospital wing? That's a record for you, isn't it? George passed it to Angelina, who reverse passed it to Harry, who had not been expecting it, but caught it in the very tips of his fingers and passed it quickly to Ron, who lunged for it and missed it by inches. Come on now, Ron, said Angelina crossly as he dived for the ground again, chasing the quaffle. Pay attention. It would have been hard to say whether Ron's face or the quaffle was a deeper scarlet when he again returned to playing height. Malfoy and the rest of the Slytherin team were howling with laughter. On the third attempt, Ron caught the quaffle. Perhaps out of relief, he passed it with enthusiasm that it soared straight through Katie's outstretched hands and it hit her hard in the face. Sorry, Ron groaned, zooming forward to see whether he had done any damage. Go back into position. She's fine, barked Angelina. But as he passed it to but as you're passing to your teammate, do try not to knock her off her broom, won't you? We've got bludgers for that. Katie's nose was bleeding. Down below, the Slytherins was stamping their feet and jeering. Fred and George converged on Katie. Here, take this, said Fred, handing her something small and purple out of his pocket. It'll clear up in no time. All right, said Angelina. Fred, George, go and get your bats and a bludger. Ron, get up to the goalpost. Harry, release the snitch when I say so. We're going to aim for Ron's goal, obviously. Harry zoomed off after the twins to fetch the snitch. Ron's making a right pig's ear of things, isn't he? Muttered George. All three of them landed in a crate containing the balls, opened it to extract one of the bludgers and the snitch. He's just nervous, said Harry. He was fine when we practiced with him this morning. Yeah, well, I hope he hasn't peaked too soon, said Fred gloomily. They returned to the air. Then Angelina blew the whistle. Harry released the snitch. Fred and George let fly the bludger. From that moment on, Harry was barely aware of what the others were doing. It was his job to recapture the tiny, fluttering golden ball, and that was worth 150 points to the Seekers team. In doing so required enormous speed and skill. He accelerated, rolling, swerving in and out of the chasers, warm autumn air whipping his face, and distant yells of the Slytherins, so much meaningless roaring in his ears. But too soon, the whistle brought him to a halt again. Stop, 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 screamed Angelina. Ron, you're not covering your middle post. Harry looked around at Ron, who was hovering in front of his left-hand post, leaving the other two completely unprotected. Oh, sorry. You keep shifting around while you're watching the chasers, said Angelina. Either stay in the center position until you have to move to defend a hoop, or else circle the hoops. But don't drift vaguely off to one side. That's how you let the last three goals. Sorry, said Ron repeated, his face shining like a beacon against the bright blue sky. And Katie, can't you do something about your nosebleed? It's just getting worse, Katie said Katie thickly, attempting to stem the flow with her sleeve. Harry glanced round at Fred, who was looking anxious and checking his pockets. He saw Fred pull out something purple, examine it for a second, then look around at Katie, evidently horror struck. Well, let's try again, said Angelina. She was ignoring the Slytherins, who had now set up a chant of Gryffindor are losers, Gryffindors are losers. But there is a certain rigidity about her set on her broomstick, nevertheless. This time they had been flying for barely 3 minutes when Angelina's whistle sounded. Harry, who had just sighted the snitch circling the opposite goalpost, pulled up, feeling distinctly aggrieved. What now? She said impatiently to Alicia, who was nearest. Katie, she said shortly. Harry turned and saw Angelina. Fred and George are flying as fast as they could towards Katie. Harry and Alicia sped towards her too. It was plain that Angelina had stopped training just in time. Katie was now chalk white and covered in blood. She needs a hospital wing, said Angelina. We'll take her, said Fred. She might have swallowed a bloody blister pod by mistake. Well, there's no point in continuing with no beaters or a chaser gone, said Angelina gloomily, as Fred and George zoomed off towards the castle, supporting Katie between them. Come on, let's go get changed. The Slytherins continued to chant as they trailed back into the changing rooms.